thank you for coming out on a rainy day. Boy, nice to see so many people. So I am Joyce Kleen. I'm a wildlife biologist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, and I'll go into a little of that before, but I started my career in 1981 in South Florida at Chassahowitzka Refuge. And I was at Chassahowitzka for 7 years before I transferred up north to New Jersey, which is where I'm from originally. So I worked in New Jersey for 2 years at the Edwin B., it's now known as the Edwin B. Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, and I was an assistant manager in charge of the Barnegat Division, which was coastal habitat where there were birds nesting on a barrier island. And then the cost of living in New Jersey, which is why I moved away from there originally, pushed me back to Florida, which is where my husband grew up in South Florida. So we moved back to Florida, and I've been at Chassahowitzka, or it used to be called the Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and we renamed it to the Crystal River National Wildlife Complex several years ago. But do I need to hit it to keep it going? And I've been here for 32 years. So I started here in 1990. So I've been here for 32 years. So I've been in the service for 41 years, almost 42 years now, and I will be retiring in June. So you're seeing me at the tail end of my career. So I always like to start with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because Peter started off with FWC. Well, I'm not FWC, that's Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So that's a state agency. I actually work for the federal government. You pay my salary. So I work under the Department of Interior, but we are a sister agency to the National Park Service. So the National Park System was established in 1872 by President Grant, and it's to benefit the people. So basically, parks are for people, and then refuges, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is all across the country. So I'm going to give you a little background information before I actually get into Chassahowitzka Refuge. So in 1903, President Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing Pelican Island. The first National Wildlife Refuge was actually on the east coast of Florida at Pelican Island. And it was set aside for native birds. So basically, parks are for people, refuges are for wildlife. So we do allow public uses, and I will get into that also. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or that manages the National Wildlife Refuge System, we actually have over 560 national wildlife refuges across the country. There's only 60 national parks. National Park Service actually manages a whole bunch more historic sites also, but there are 560 national wildlife refuges across the country. So if you haven't been to the National Wildlife Refuge System, your tax dollars pay for this. So you want to get a America the Beautiful pass and travel across country and visit your national wildlife refuges. So this is the mission of the refuge system. We actually have a tower also, like you have a wildlife observation tower that's at our salt marsh trails. But our mission is to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats within the U.S. for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans. So that's our mission. So we do allow public uses. So there's 6 priority public uses that we allow on national wildlife refuges. And they were recognized in the National Wildlife Refuge Improvement Act: hunting, fishing, wildlife observation, wildlife photography, environmental education, and interpretation. And all of those occur on Chassahowitzka Refuge. So our refuge complex, we actually manage 5 national wildlife refuges. They're all located on the Gulf Coast of Florida: Crystal River, Chassahowitzka, Pinellas, Egmont Key, and Passage. Those 5 refuges right there. And here it kind of shows the distance between them all road-wise. So it's about 70 miles to get down to our Tampa Bay refuges, the 3 of which are in Tampa Bay, and I'll give you a little snippet of those 5 refuges that we manage. So it's over 32,000 acres that we manage in 5 counties. So Egmont Key National Wildlife Refuge is open to public use. It was established in 1974. Right now it's about a 250-acre barrier island. It was was almost 500 acres in the early 1900s, like 1899, it was actually 500 acres. But when we acquired it, it was probably about 370 acres, and we've lost a lot of it to erosion. We actually manage it cooperatively with Florida Park Service. So it's actually known as Egmont Key National Wildlife Refuge and State Park. And this year, unfortunately, was a really bad year for nesting birds. We only had a little over 5,600 pairs of nesting birds, but we had a record 48,000 pairs in 2015. And the reason for the decline, because for 20 or so years, we had tens of thousands of nesting birds. We had one raccoon on the island. One raccoon. And that one raccoon caused the population of birds to drop. It dropped even more in 2022. We only had less than 200 pairs of birds nesting. And the raccoon is gone. It was removed in January, but birds have a long memory. And I'm hoping in March when I do my next bird survey out there that they will come back, but I'm not sure they're going to come back. But we also have loggerhead sea turtles that nest out there. And for some reason, the raccoon was not bugging the sea turtle nests, but it certainly was attacking the bird nests. But we had 120 nests recorded in 2021. And actually, that was 2022 that we had the 120 nests. But we had a record of 164 nests in 2018. So Passage Key is just south of Egmont Key, and it was established in 1905. So it's actually one of the first national wildlife refuges, because Pelican Island was established in 1903. And it was established as a preserve and breeding ground for native birds. It was 63 acres when it was acquired. Now it's a 10 to 30 acre meandering sandbar, so hurricanes have wiped it out. It's come back, it gets wiped out, so it shifts constantly. And it does provide nesting habitat for thousands of terns, gulls, and skimmers, and it is closed to all public use. So it went underwater in 2007 due to a hurricane. We celebrated its centennial in 2005, so it was still there, thankfully. And then 2 years later, it went underwater, so it was gone. It was literally gone for many years. And then all of a sudden, I get a call from Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and they're like, aren't you going to protect the birds nesting on Passage Key? And I'm like, there's birds nesting on Passage Key? I didn't even know the island was back. So in 2014, the island actually came back. It grows and disappears over the years. So when we did go out there in 2014, sure enough, birds were nesting on the island again. So, and they did great the past couple of years. They've done really well. And then we have Pinellas Refuge, which is made up of several mangrove islands, and it was established in 1922 as a breeding ground for colonial birds. And it's about 394 acres. We have had a little bit of erosion. I don't know if you can see, I don't know if this has a pointer? No. Okay. Little Bird Key in the upper left there, that island has had some severe erosion in the past, and we've done some work there to establish it, or regrow it, I should say that. So it does provide nesting habitat for brown pelicans, roseate spoonbills, reddish egrets, and cormorants, and it too is closed to all public use. So then I'll go on to Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge, which is actually where our headquarters is. So it was established in 1983 for the protection of the West Indian manatee, and we have a little over 139 acres, and we manage lands and waters. So by Banana Island, we actually own some of those submerged lands south of Banana Island. And we also manage 40 acres, additional acres of manatee sanctuaries in Kings Bay. And one of the things we try to do is foster a public commitment and understanding of manatees and their need for protection. And I'll go into our visitor center later, but if you haven't been there, you've got to come. So then on to what you're here for, Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge. So it was established in 1941 as a migratory bird sanctuary. It's almost 31,000 acres, and we have 23,000 acres of designated wilderness, which means that's Class 1 airspace over that wilderness. It's summer habitat for manatees, whereas Crystal River National Wildlife Refuge is primarily winter habitat for manatees. Chassahowitzka is summer habitat for manatees. And it was a former reintroduction site for whooping cranes. Was anybody here for the whooping crane reintroduction? Yes. But unfortunately, they're not there anymore. But for 10 years, we worked on trying to reintroduce whooping cranes to the area. And it's also black bear habitat. I don't know if people know this, but and I brought some information on our black bear project. But in the some research has been done on Chassahowitzka with black bears. Some black bears have been collared in the area, and they were using either Chassahowitzka Refuge or Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area adjacent to the refuge. So there is some use of the refuge by black bears. So this is the refuge. It's kind of evenly divided, more habitat in Citrus County. So north of that line is Citrus County, and then south is Hernando County, so the refuge is kind of divided between the two areas. We do have a few little public use facilities. There's the Dog Island Recreation Area on the Chassahowitzka River itself, which is a porta potty. There's a picnic table, a dock that you can get out and utilize. But there's a lot of public use that occurs on Chas, mostly fishing is the big public use, but we do have hunting on the refuge also. So these are all the uses that are allowed on the refuge. So fishing, crabbing, scalloping, hunting, wildlife photography, wildlife observation, environmental education, interpretation, boating. Airboating is allowed in the Hernando County section of the refuge, only on designated trails in Citrus County, and you have to have a permit. The permit is free. The reason we require it is we provide you with the regulations for why you can airboat, how you can airboat out there. You have to stay in the water. You can't put your airboat up on land, all that kind of stuff. Paddlecraft are allowed, and we do have some hiking trails. So there's a couple hiking trails. This is one. The other one is actually located around our maintenance facility, which is right on Highway 19. I don't know if you know where the fire tower is for Homosassa Tract. Burnt Bridge Road, yeah. So that's our maintenance facility actually. And outside our fenced compound is a nature trail that you can walk on. The other nature trails are here at Salt Marsh Trails. So this is in Old Homosassa off Mason Creek Road. And there's a very small parking area right on Mason Creek Road, and then you can walk in and walk to these trails. And where that kayak launch is, you can see it says Lastinger Tower, so there is an observation tower there. And the tower oversees Battle Creek, which leads into kind of the Mason Creek area. But it's a pretty area down there. Just beware of cottonmouths, because there are a lot of snakes in that area. So if you're in there in the summertime, beware of cottonmouths. So the wilderness that I was telling you about, so all the shaded area on this map in both Citrus and Hernando County are actually wilderness areas, designated wilderness. So over 23,000 acres in Citrus County, or total, over almost 17,000 acres in Citrus, and over 6,700 acres in Hernando County. There's no signs, structures, roads, anywhere. And what I was telling you before about the Class 1 airspace, the cleanest air around. So if there is a power plant or anything that's producing emissions that is within 60 miles or 100 kilometers of this wilderness area, those emissions have to be below a certain level in order to maintain that Class 1 airspace. So even if you never get to Chassahowitzka Refuge and get out there on a boat, be grateful that it's there because it's clean air because of that designated wilderness that's out there. So I want to go into a little bit about the habitats that are found on the refuge. So over 17,000 acres of salt marsh habitat on the refuge, and it's mostly black needle rush. We have a lot of alligators on the refuge, so keep that in mind. Some 14-foot long ones that we've seen out there. One very secretive bird that's on the refuge, I mean, rails in general are secretive, but clapper rails are one of the birds that is out there and very secretive. Usually we see them just popping out from the sawgrass or needle rush. Mixed hardwood swamp, we have over 2,500 acres of mixed hardwood swamp. And some of the species that you find in there, I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with the barred owls. They're probably the friendliest of the owls. And their call sounds like "Who cooks for you all?" if you ever hear them talk. And we do have 25 mammal species, including raccoons. We have feral hogs, black bears, bobcats, possums, fox, deer, armadillos, rodents, you name it, we probably have it. No reported panthers, but lots of bobcats. So maritime hammock, over 250 acres of maritime or upland forest out on the refuge. And some of the species, bald eagles that we find, historically, the eagles would nest just off refuge at in the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area. Sometimes even right on the boundary of the refuge. But this nest actually was found on the refuge. So we actually have 2 eagle nests on the refuge right now, smack in the middle of the refuge, which is really good. So my coworker who retired from the service, he was helping contractors navigate the refuge because he knew it like the back of his hand. And he actually found one of the eagle nests because it was in an area that we normally don't survey. And then there was another nest that we found in an area that's routinely surveyed. And then, of course, as I mentioned, cottonmouths. So, and they can be in the hammocks, they can be anywhere. So just keep an eye out for them. I don't know where this picture came from, but that's a really light cottonmouth. Most of the cottonmouths I see are very, very dark. So don't think they all look like that. Most of them are very, very, very dark, but they do blend in with their environment, so very hard to see. So we have over 10,000 acres of estuarine habitat, rivers and tidal streams that are within the refuge. And you can find lots of dolphins out there. We have lots of manatees out there. You'll see the dolphins rounding up mullet, chasing them into islands and rounding up mullet. And summer habitat for manatees, maybe 50, I think was the highest count I got from aerial surveys was probably about 49. So, roughly 50 animals that utilize it. And I don't know if there's a manatee called Rachel, and I'm hoping she's still alive, but she was actually an orphaned calf that was rescued from the Chassahowitzka River off refuge, upriver, but she was, teeny tiny, 60 pounds when she was rescued. And this was probably 1990 when I first got here. And she was taken to Chazzahowitzka Wildlife Park and raised. She was raised for 7 years, and then my agency, through another office, was requiring any wild-born, healthy animals needed to be released back to the wild. So she was actually released. First, she was released right outside Chazzahowitzka Wildlife Park. So she was hanging right outside the park, eating all the water lettuce that they were feeding the captive animals. And she was hanging right there because she was getting free food. She didn't have to fend for herself. So we moved her to, actually I think we didn't move her yet, but she made her way downriver, but she ended up at McRae's boat ramp. So she was right in a bad spot where people were launching their boats. So we picked her up and we moved her to the Chassahowitzka River because that's where she was orphaned from. So we moved her there. Well, then we got, she was a known animal, so we got all these complaints that she was going to get hit by a boat because there were no speed regulations on the Chassahowitzka River. So we picked her up again, and she had a satellite tag on her, so we knew where she was. So we picked her up again, and we moved her to Kings Bay to Crystal River area, because bigger area, speed restrictions in the wintertime, so a little more protection. Well, then I think the tag was probably cut off that last time. Then she disappeared. We didn't know where she was. And I don't know if it was about a few months later or within a year, she was found again in the Chassahowitzka River by herself. She had made it there on her own with a calf. Wow. So she had actually bred, right after being released, was pregnant for 13 months and had a calf with her. So that was a success story for sure. And she, did somebody have a question? She actually has, I would say she's responsible for the majority of the population of manatees in the Chassahowitzka Refuge, because she has kids and grandkids, on and on. I mean, and she's been out there for many, many years, but she's responsible for a bulk of those, I would say at least 20 animals that are in that population. So she's been very successful reproducing and raising young there. So she's done very, very, very well. So within that estuarine habitat that we also have lots of seagrass beds. And sea turtles, mostly green sea turtles, are found, and their diet is made up of seagrasses. We do have some researchers on the refuge that are doing some sea turtle research. I haven't gotten any, I don't think they've tagged anything on the refuge. They're doing some other coastal waters, but they said they would let me know if they actually caught it. I know they're out there because I see them, but I don't think they've actually caught any on the refuge yet. But obviously, we also have stingrays out there, and they feed on crustaceans and mollusks out there. So lots of critters live in the seagrass area. And we have mangrove islands. That mangrove island on the right is not Chassahowitzka, but just kind of shows you an overall look of a mangrove island that's probably in the Tampa Bay area. But these two pictures on the left were taken on Chassahowitzka Refuge. So we have about 600 acres of mangrove islands, and I used to do monthly bird surveys on Chassahowitzka, but because of lots of other priorities, I only do like one peak count each year. And we're actually looking for reddish egrets, which is a very rare bird. So the picture at the top is a roseate spoonbill and 2 immature white ibis. The one at the bottom is an immature reddish egret. So we have actually documented 4 reddish egret nests on Chassahowitzka Refuge. So that's very significant because I'm in a reddish egret working group, and any nesting of reddish egrets is very important. So Chaz is important habitat for that. So these mangrove islands, like I said, they're excellent for herons, egrets, ibis, spoonbills, cormorants. We have no spoonbills nesting. They roost there, but they don't nest. We have hundreds of cormorants that actually nest on those mangrove islands. And like I said, the reddish egrets have been there for about 4 to 5 years. And that root system of the mangroves provides lots of nursery habitat for fish and lots of other aquatic critters. So some of the projects that are going on, we actually have, and this is through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but they're using our refuge to put this tower. It's called a MODIS tower. It's a wildlife tracking system. So when birds have a tag on them and they pass, during migration, they pass by this tower, the tower actually picks up their signal and reports what that species is, because the tag actually has the species and where that bird was actually tagged. So it's monitoring the migration of these birds, which is really interesting. And I think people can access this too. If you Google MODIS, it'll probably come up with something that you can access. So this is kind of hard to see, but some of the initial locations are on the right. So in Canada, like Montreal and towards the east, I don't know if that's Nova Scotia, but that's where some of the tagging has happened. And then there's towers all along the way that they're tracking how these birds are actually migrating, which is really kind of cool. So all those refuges in the left slide are where all these towers are. So they can pick up where all these birds are are moving through. And these are some of the species that they're actually tracking. Warblers, swallows, nighthawks, thrushes, plovers, rails, lots of different warblers. So very, very interesting work that they're doing. We had a contract to do exotic plant control on the refuge a few years ago. We really didn't, we knew we had exotics out there. We had Brazilian pepper, but we didn't know how many exotics, what the acreage was. And you actually have to put that kind of information into a contract when you're putting it out for bid. So we hired Florida Natural Areas Inventory to actually do a vegetation survey on the refuge. And we were looking at a couple things. We were looking at exotic plants for future treatment, but we were also looking at a comparison of 1941 vegetation to 2018 vegetation, which is when they did the survey. On the historic, you see little red. The red is actually showing mangrove swamp. And then on the right, you can see an increase in mangrove swamp. So there's a dramatic increase from 41 to now. Anybody have any idea why that would happen? Exactly. It's exactly what's happening. So this is the acreage of what's happened. So mangrove swamp has gone from 291 acres to over 1,300 acres as it was mapped on Chaz. So, a huge increase, 64% change. And then you have at the expense of salt marsh. So we're actually losing salt marsh habitat. So, and it's gone down almost 2,000 acres from sea level rise. You're actually losing those plants. But the tidal creek has increased because sea level rise. So it was very dramatic, seeing what this change was with their mapping. I mean, I've seen it because I'm out there doing surveys, so I've actually seen it. But and same with when I fly manatee surveys in Crystal River, I photograph the manatees in the water, but I'm also photographing refuge islands. Some of those islands have gone underwater. In the 32 years that I've been here, they're underwater now. They don't exist. Yeah, somebody asked me one time, and this was a gentleman who worked for Citrus County, and he said, what disease is killing all the palm trees on Chassahowitzka Refuge? I said, well, it's called sea level rise. I said, it's saltwater intrusion, and that's what's killing them. Yeah, and I mean, we've had, you have some of those catastrophic events, the no-name storm in 93, Tropical Storm Josephine in 96, Hurricane Hermine in 2016. You've had all these catastrophic events that have happened in addition to sea level rise, and as you said, freezes, we are warming. So, and when I first got here, I think there were bad freeze, well, before I got here, I think there was a bad freeze in 85, 90, like the early 90s. I think there were several bad freezes, which kept the mangroves in check. And they weren't spreading, but these freezes have decreased. So it has helped allow the expansion of mangroves, like you said, even further north. But the rate of sea level rise is 2.13 millimeters per year as measured in a station in Cedar Key. And I can't remember, the one gentleman, I think he was saying 8 inches over the last 50 years is what I've heard. That's a lot of water.
And it's probably is increasing.
Yeah.
It'll be more than 8 inches the next 20
Yeah,
years.
exactly. And this is the study itself that they did. So if you want to look at that, I think I actually have a copy of it here with me. Historic and Current Vegetation Communities at Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge. And it was done by what's called FNA, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, is who actually did the report. So, and then back to our headquarters. So we have a brand new visitor center, brand new office, and an environmental classroom. So we could actually do talks like this at our office in the future. But if you haven't been there, you have to come because it's really, we did a lot of work on that visitor center. So if you haven't been there, please visit. But this is a little tidbit of the inside. So if anybody have grandkids? If you have grandkids, we have a fart machine. We have a fart button that you can press that your grandkids will enjoy. That was my boss's. She wanted that fart machine. She has 3 kids, so she wanted that in there, and it's in there. But anyway, come visit us because we're open actually right now 7 days a week from 9 to 4 o'clock. So come visit. So, and for those of you, because I know Aiden and Medeiros are not familiar with the whooping crane project, so what they were doing was flying whooping cranes behind ultralights from Necedah Refuge in Wisconsin to Chassahowitzka Refuge in Florida, and Chaz was wintering habitat for the whooping cranes. So we actually built a whooping crane pen on the refuge, and Young of the Year were in this pen because that's the critical time is you want the survival of those young birds. So we didn't know if they would come back years after that, but they did. Some of the adults actually came back. Well, the adults and the young don't get along, so there's some fights there because the adults are, they're dominant over those young birds, but we put a top net on the young birds, and they were kind of kept separate from the older birds. But they moved to other areas. They moved to like inland areas. They found it better habitat, I guess, inland instead of on Chassahowitzka Refuge. They need 21 parts per thousand salinity or less. So I don't know if our salinities are increasing way too high for them or what. But the program went on for 10 years where they flew these birds behind the ultralight from Wisconsin to Florida. And we knew that wasn't going to last forever, so they wanted a different way of introducing these birds, and they called it DAR, Direct Autumn Release. So they were releasing young birds of the year with older birds that had been taught the migration route. So these older birds were actually following, or the young of the year were following these older birds to Florida, which was much more natural. The ultralight was so unnatural. The ultralight can't fly in snow, rain, wind, a headwind. They have to wait for the thermals to, for the wind. They start out at daybreak, because they land when it's windy, when the thermals pick up. Well, that's completely opposite of natural migration with whooping cranes. Whooping cranes don't fly at daybreak. They wait for those thermals. So when those thermals start rising, the birds start rising with them. So at 10 o'clock in the morning, they're ready to fly. So the direct autumn release was much more natural, and they are still doing that, but more in I think it's the Louisiana area. I'm trying to remember. I think it's, marsh in Louisiana. So not so much in Florida, but I think some of these birds are going to Louisiana. There were 2 separate populations in Florida. So one was the migratory population that was being flown behind the ultralight. One was a non-migratory population that Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission was overseeing in the Kissimmee Prairie. And that population is probably, if it's not completely gone, it's almost gone. Bobcats were nailing those birds. So they were major, major predators. Even though whooping cranes roost in water, and why they roost in water is so they, hear a predator coming after them. They'll hear a bobcat hit the water and then they can take off. But bobcats just devastated that population. So overall, the population has increased. There's still the wild population that migrates from Canada to Aransas Refuge in Texas. I think it's over I haven't kept up with it as much as I should, but I think it's over 400 birds. So and it was down to 15, like somebody just said, So they're still with us, thankfully, but just not on Chassahowitzka Refuge, unfortunately. Thanks.